Long before ships crossed the Atlantic carrying chained men and women, long before racist laws divided streets and destinies in the United States, there was already a place where slavery was written in stone itself. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and the cradle of a system of oppression that would shape the world for millennia. In this video, you will discover how the first laws, engraved more than 4,000 years ago, turned human beings into property, and how that mindset still breathes in racism in America, systemic racism and racial discrimination that we see today. Get ready. What you are about to hear may change the way you see the entire history of slavery. Mesopotamia, located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is often celebrated as the cradle of civilization. It was there that the first city-states, cuneiform writing, organized agriculture, and unfortunately, the earliest documented forms of slavery emerged. Walking through those lands more than 4,000 years ago, a visitor would find markets full of grain, artisans shaping metals, and amid all that vitality, men and women with marks on their bodies and in their eyes, living witnesses of a system that reduced them to property. It was the beginning of something that, over time, would shape societies across the world, including the roots of slavery in the United States and the systemic racism that still echoes today. The first Mesopotamian cities, such as Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, were not only centers of trade and culture, but also places where inequality became law. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of an elite that controlled land, armies, and temples, while the most vulnerable were pushed into servitude. Cuneiform writing, celebrated as a great human advancement, was also used to record contracts for the purchase and sale of people, debts that condemned entire families to slavery, and sentences that sealed fates. On those clay tablets, slavery did not appear as a moral anomaly, but as part of the natural functioning of society. A man in debt could hand over his wife and children as payment. Prisoners of war were sold in markets. Children born to enslaved women automatically inherited their mother's status. These records show that, from the very beginning, oppression was rationalized and legalized, something that centuries later would also occur with the Jim Crow laws and other legislation that institutionalized racial discrimination in the United States. Religion, in turn, also played a crucial role. Priests and scribes taught that the social order was determined by the gods. Thus, questioning slavery was, in many cases, questioning the cosmos itself. This echoes the way racist ideologies in the US were justified by distorted interpretations of religious texts to legitimize racism in America. It is as if history were always ready to repeat itself, merely changing the scenery and the actors. The enslaved labor force drove the economic heart of Mesopotamia. They were the ones who built irrigation canals, erected monumental temples, and cultivated the fields that fed the cities. In return, they received only the bare minimum to survive, a pattern of exploitation that reappears in different forms throughout history. It is impossible not to draw a parallel with the enslaved labor that sustained cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations in the southern United States, leaving a legacy still felt in African American history and in the struggle for civil rights. These connections between past and present reveal something unsettling. Mesopotamian slavery is not merely an ancient chapter, but the prologue to a much longer narrative. By understanding how it emerged and was maintained, we can see how societies develop mechanisms to normalize oppression. Modern systemic racism, with its invisible barriers, carries the same logic that was once carved in stone. At the end of this first deep dive, we are not only looking at a distant world, we are looking at an ancient mirror that reflects the roots of contemporary inequalities. And it is with that understanding that we move on to the next chapter, where we will see how a set of laws, the famous Code of Hammurabi, not only consolidated slavery, but elevated it to the status of written law, shaping mindsets and systems that still echo disturbingly to this day. Imagine standing before an imposing black stone monument covered with intricate lines of cuneiform writing. At the top, King Hammurabi stands, receiving a scepter from the hands of Shamash, the god of justice. The scene is not merely a religious symbol, it is the consecration of a set of laws that for the first time in history consolidated slavery as a written and legitimized norm. The Code of Hammurabi, engraved around 1754 BC, was not a simple legal manual. It was an instrument of power that shaped behavior and mentalities, fixing in stone the inequality between masters and the enslaved. Among its nearly 300 recorded laws, several dealt specifically with the status of enslaved people. Severe punishments were defined for those who helped a slave escape. The market value of these lives was regulated, and it was established that the condition of slavery was hereditary. The cold letter of the law turned oppression into something natural, unquestionable, and above all, eternal. Thus, slavery ceased to be merely the result of force and became a principle recognized and protected by the state. The parallel with the history of slavery in the United States is inevitable. Just like the Code of Hammurabi, American legislation, from the colonial laws to the Jim Crow laws, not only tolerated but formalized racial discrimination. It was the law that determined who could own land, vote, receive an education, or even walk freely through the streets. When oppression is legalized, it becomes more deeply rooted in the culture, turning into part of a nation's identity. One of the darkest aspects of the code is the way it punished the same crime differently, depending on the victim's social status. A master who killed his slave did not receive the same sentence as a slave who killed his master. This disparity in the application of justice echoes in modern systemic racism, where studies show that crimes committed against African Americans often receive lighter sentences, while crimes committed by them are punished more harshly. The laws also regulated the marriage and family life of the enslaved. A free man who married an enslaved woman did not automatically free his wife, and the children of that union belonged to the mother's master. This same logic of control over bodies and bloodlines was present in the United States, where African American families were systematically separated and sold, and where the very concept of freedom was manipulated to maintain the racial hierarchy. In addition, the Code of Hammurabi established extreme corporal punishments to discipline the enslaved and reinforce fear. The logic was clear: a system of terror preserves obedience. This mentality of control through fear still resonates in contemporary practices of disproportionate police violence against the black community, a central theme in discussions about civil rights and racism in America. The presence of the god Shamash at the top of the code's stele was not merely decorative, it was a powerful political message. By presenting the laws as a divine gift, Hammurabi shielded them from criticism and questioning. The same pattern repeated in American history, where racist ideologies were often legitimized by distorted religious interpretations, reinforcing systemic racism. With the Code of Hammurabi, slavery in Mesopotamia took on a new dimension. It ceased to be merely a social fact and became a legal ideal, perpetuated by the strength of tradition and the fear of the divine. This legacy, carved in stone almost 4,000 years ago, extends into modern legal structures that, although they no longer proclaim slavery, still carry traces of its spirit. And it is precisely to understand how these laws directly affected people's lives that in the next chapter we will explore who the enslaved in Mesopotamia were, how they lived, where they came from, and how their reality eerily anticipates the stories recorded in African American history. In the vastness of Mesopotamia's city-states, slavery had many faces and origins. It was not a homogeneous system, but a mosaic of stories marked by violence, necessity, and often sheer bad luck. The enslaved came from three main sources: prisoners of war, people in debt, and children born to enslaved mothers. This diversity of origins created an internal hierarchy among the captives themselves, but the final outcome was almost always the same: the total loss of freedom and autonomy. Prisoners of war were perhaps the most numerous during periods of military expansion. Victorious armies returned with long lines of men, women, and children, all marked to be sold or assigned to forced labor. This practice echoes the history of slavery in the United States, where African peoples, captured in conflicts or kidnapped from their villages, were transported to a similar fate, crossing the Atlantic toward plantations and mines. In both cases, capture marked the beginning of a cycle of exploitation that did not end with the life of the individual, but extended for generations. The second source of enslaved people was debt. In an agricultural society, a bad harvest or livestock plague could ruin an entire family. When the debt became impossible to pay, the debtor could be forced to surrender himself or members of his family as payment. In Mesopotamia, this debt slavery was sometimes legal and temporary, but the reality was that many never regained freedom. This mechanism is reminiscent of modern economic practices that, although not formal slavery, perpetuate inequality, creating a racial wealth gap that especially affects African Americans, heirs to centuries of economic exclusion. The third group was the children of enslaved women. Under Mesopotamian law, a child born to an enslaved mother automatically inherited her status regardless of the father. This hereditary transmission of condition served as a silent engine of slavery, ensuring a constant supply of labor. The same perverse logic was present in the United States, where laws defined that a child's status followed that of the mother, creating entire generations trapped in an inescapable cycle of servitude. In daily life, the experience of the enslaved varied according to their skills and the mood of their masters. Some worked in the fields, exposed to the scorching sun, while others served in the homes of the wealthy, performing domestic or artisanal tasks. Although domestic work was physically less brutal, it was still a space of constant surveillance, with little or no room for personal dignity. The situation is comparable to narratives from African American history, where many enslaved people were used as domestic workers but remained subject to abuse and deprivation. Control over the enslaved was not only physical but also psychological. Marks on the body, such as tattoos or cuts, were used to identify and humiliate. Surveillance and the fear of severe punishment maintained order. These control techniques parallel modern practices of surveillance and coercion that fall disproportionately on black communities, fueling discussions on systemic racism and racial discrimination. Enslaved women faced an additional double burden. Beyond physical labor, many were forced to perform sexual roles for their masters, producing children who, by law, belonged to them. This tragically echoes slavery in the United States, where black women were often exploited in this way, and the children of that violence became the master's property. These stories show that, although contexts and technologies change, structures of exploitation have a frightening persistence. In Mesopotamia, as in the United States, slavery was not merely a physical state of captivity, but a social and psychological prison built to perpetuate itself. In the next chapter, we will dive into resistance, because even in the face of chains, laws, and gods that seemed invincible, there were always those who dared to flee, fight, and challenge the system, opening paths that millennia later would inspire movements like the civil rights movement in the struggle against racism in America. As much as slavery in Mesopotamia was sustained by laws, religion, and military power, it was never passively accepted by all. Among cuneiform records and archaeological accounts, we find evidence of escapes, revolts, and small acts of insubordination. These fragments of resistance reveal that, even when all seemed lost, there were those who refused to live without freedom. Escaping, however, was extremely risky. The city-states were surrounded by deserts, mighty rivers, and potential enemies. Anyone who dared to flee had to rely on allies willing to risk their lives to help. However, the Code of Hammurabi made it clear, anyone who helped a slave escape would be severely punished. This intimidation strategy not only isolated the captive, but also undermined solidarity between free people and the enslaved, something that centuries later would be repeated in the United States, with laws that criminalized those who aided fugitive slaves, such as the Fugitive Slave Act. Not all resistance was open. Many times, it happened silently, working more slowly, damaging tools, hiding resources, or passing down stories and traditions that strengthened the collective identity of the captives. This cultural resistance echoes in African American history, where songs, folktales, and religious practices became tools of spiritual survival and the preservation of dignity, even in the face of systemic racism. Enslaved women played a crucial role in this regard. In addition to caring for children, many preserved culinary, artisanal, and spiritual traditions that resisted attempts at cultural erasure. This preservation of memory is comparable to what occurred during slavery in the United States, when Black women were the guardians of oral histories and African American culture, passing the flame of resistance from generation to generation. On the other hand, Mesopotamian authorities invested heavily in repression. The punishments for enslaved people captured after an escape attempt were brutal, from physical mutilations to public executions, always with the goal of creating a terrifying example for others. This calculated use of violence as a tool of control recalls modern practices of disproportionate repression against Black communities, a central theme in debates on racial discrimination and civil rights. Some records speak of collective revolts. Small groups of enslaved people would set ambushes, burn plantations, or attack trade caravans. Although they rarely won on the battlefield, these actions undermined the ruling elite's sense of security. It is impossible not to think of slave rebellions in the American South, such as the revolt led by Nat Turner, which, even though it was repressed with extreme violence, inspired fear in slaveholding structures and hope among the oppressed. Repression was not only physical, it was also psychological and symbolic. Public festivals celebrated military victories that resulted in the capture of new enslaved people, reinforcing the idea that submission was inevitable. These events legitimized oppression in the eyes of society, just as parades and ceremonies in the post-abolition period in the United States often reinforced racial hierarchies, even after the formal end of slavery. But the most striking thing is realizing that despite all the risks, the flame of freedom never went out. Every successful escape, every act of disobedience, every tradition preserved was a small victory against a system designed to crush any sign of autonomy. This silent and continuous struggle built a legacy that re-emerges in different times and places, including the modern fight against racism in America and movements seeking to dismantle systemic racism. In the next chapter, we will explore how slavery in Mesopotamia was not merely a social or political issue, but an economic pillar that supported the entire productive system. We will see how this dependence on enslaved labor created a lucrative machine, and how, centuries later, this same logic would shape the slavery-based economy in the United States, leaving scars still visible in the racial wealth gap. Slavery in Mesopotamia was not just a social or legal element, it was the engine that drove the economy. Every brick laid in a temple, every irrigation canal dug, and every abundant harvest invisibly carried the sweat and pain of thousands of enslaved people. Without this labor force, the city-states would not have grown at the same speed or sustained the luxury of the ruling elites. The Mesopotamian agricultural system depended heavily on enslaved labor. Large tracts of land, owned by temples, palaces, or wealthy families, were cultivated by men and women deprived of freedom. They plowed the land under the scorching sun with no right to adequate rest and minimal food. This production base allowed masters to accumulate surpluses, which were then sold or traded for other goods, fueling both local and international commerce. The logic is frighteningly similar to that which sustained the economy of slavery in the United States, where cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations generated immense profits for owners and for the country itself, while keeping millions in subhuman conditions. Beyond agriculture, the enslaved were essential in building monumental works. Irrigation canals, defensive walls, temples, and palaces existed only thanks to captive labor. These constructions were not merely infrastructure. They were symbols of power and authority. By erecting temples dedicated to the gods or imposing walls to protect the city, the elites displayed their wealth and reinforced the social order that placed the enslaved at the base of the pyramid. This relationship between forced labor and public prestige also repeated itself in American history, where the wealth built by enslaved labor helped erect not only plantations but entire cities. Commerce was also fueled by slavery. Enslaved people were high-value commodities in Mesopotamian markets, bought and sold like any other good. There were trade routes connecting different regions, carrying not only grain, metals, and textiles, but also people. This commodification of human life finds its echo in the transatlantic trade of Africans, one of the most brutal chapters of African-American history, which generated fortunes and cemented inequalities still evident in the racial wealth gap. Another important economic aspect was debt slavery. Many free peasants, faced with poor harvests or unpayable tributes, ended up offering themselves or family members as payment. Although in theory it was a temporary servitude, in practice many never regained their freedom. This mechanism transferred wealth and labor to the elites, deepening inequality. In the modern context, although formal slavery has been abolished, unequal and discriminatory economic systems continue to affect black communities, perpetuating subtle forms of racial discrimination and financial exclusion. Mesopotamian elites understood perfectly the economic value of slavery. For them, each enslaved person represented not only a labor force, but a long-term asset capable of generating wealth for an entire lifetime, and beyond, since children inherited the mother's condition. This view reduced human beings to mere instruments of production, erasing any trace of individuality or dignity. It is a mentality that also sustained slavery in the United States, where the reproduction of enslaved people was seen as an investment, ensuring new workers without purchase costs in the market. This economic system, both efficient and inhumane, created a machine so finely tuned that it endured for centuries. The prosperity of Mesopotamian cities was directly tied to the exploitation of human lives, a reality that forces us to reflect on how, even today, economic structures can continue to benefit some at the expense of others' oppression. In the next chapter, we will see how, even in such a closed system, there was the promise, often an illusory one, of freedom. We will explore whether manumission in Mesopotamia was truly a path to breaking the chains, or merely another cog in the machinery of control, something that, centuries later, would find a parallel in the Emancipation Proclamation and in the post-slavery racial discrimination that marked the period after abolition in the United States. In Mesopotamia, the idea of freedom for an enslaved person existed more as a promise than as a concrete reality. Laws and cuneiform records speak of the possibility of manumission, the act of freeing an enslaved person. But when we examine the details, we see that this freedom rarely meant full independence. Just as would happen thousands of years later in the United States, liberation often came with conditions and restrictions that kept inequality alive. Cases of liberation could occur for different reasons. Some enslaved individuals managed to purchase their own freedom, accumulating resources through additional work allowed by the master. Others were freed as a reward for loyalty, for services rendered, or even by testamentary orders. There were also liberations for religious reasons, such as offerings to the gods, where an enslaved person was symbolically given to a deity, but continued serving in the temple. This form of freedom was more ritual than practical. The parallel with the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States is inevitable. Although it was a historic milestone, the decree of 1863 did not automatically guarantee real freedom for all enslaved people. Many were forced to continue working for their former masters under abusive contracts or debt servitude systems known as sharecropping. Post-slavery racial discrimination maintained economic, social, and political barriers that severely limited African Americans' access to true independence. In Mesopotamia, a freed enslaved person still faced deep disadvantages. Society was rigidly hierarchical, and social mobility was virtually non-existent. The former enslaved person carried the stigma of their past, seen as someone of inferior status. Many remained economically dependent on their former masters, whether due to lack of land or lack of opportunities. This condition echoes the modern reality of the racial wealth gap, where historical inequalities continue to limit the prosperity of black communities. There were also cases of conditional freedom, in which the former enslaved person had to continue serving for a period or fulfill certain obligations to maintain their new status. Any failure could result in the loss of freedom and a return to captivity. This structure of control resembles modern mechanisms of surveillance and criminalization that disproportionately affect African Americans, reinforcing systemic racism. Interestingly, some records show enslaved people who refused formal freedom, choosing to remain with their masters. This decision, seemingly paradoxical, was often due to fear of the unknown or a lack of resources to survive outside the household or estate where they worked. At its core, this reflects the power of social conditioning and the difficulty of breaking from structures that shape life from birth. In U.S. history, there were also cases of former enslaved people who, for lack of viable alternatives, ended up returning to exploitative forms of labor. Liberation, therefore, was an ambiguous concept. Although it existed on paper, it did not mean equality. In many ways, it served as a political and propagandistic tool, showing the master as benevolent and just, while in practice, the system that sustained slavery remained intact. This logic is not far from how, after abolition in the United States, governments and elites used the rhetoric of freedom to mask policies that perpetuated racial discrimination. In the next chapter, we will see how, beyond laws and promises of freedom, there was a cultural and psychological legacy that spanned centuries. We will explore how the memory of slavery in Mesopotamia, carved in stone and passed down through generations, echoes in modern movements like Black Lives Matter and in the fight against racism in America, revealing that, although the stage changes, the marks of oppression continue to shape the present. Slavery in Mesopotamia did not remain only on clay tablets or stone inscriptions. It left a psychological and cultural legacy that crossed generations. The system of domination was not limited to chains and physical punishments. It shaped how people saw themselves and others. This invisible heritage is as powerful as any wall built in the past and continues to influence societies to this day. Cuneiform records did not merely describe slavery, they normalized it. Reading laws, contracts, and commercial notes, we see that the condition of being enslaved was treated as something natural and legitimate. This formed a collective mindset in which inequality did not need justification. It simply existed. This naturalization of oppression is one of the pillars of modern systemic racism, where invisible barriers are maintained not by explicit laws, but by centuries of inherited habits, beliefs, and structures. Just as Mesopotamia used its records to reinforce social order, the history of the United States is also full of documents, laws, and speeches that consolidated racial discrimination. From the Jim Crow laws to post-abolition labor contracts, the role of writing and documentation was crucial in maintaining control over African American communities. What is written shapes what is thought, and what is thought shapes what is lived. The cultural memory of slavery also manifested in rituals and ceremonies. Festivals celebrating military victories, for example, exalted the capture of new enslaved people as a collective triumph. This glorification of conquest reinforced the idea that subjugating other peoples was not only acceptable, but a source of pride. In a disturbing parallel, we see how in different eras, societies exalted symbols and narratives that perpetuated racial hierarchies, even when formal slavery had already been abolished. But memory is not maintained only by the oppressor's imposition. The oppressed also keep their stories, and in them they find strength. In Mesopotamia, oral traditions, songs, and cultural practices preserved the identity of the enslaved, even when all seemed lost. This role of memory as resistance reappears powerfully in African American history, where spirituals, ancestral stories, and artistic expressions were weapons against forgetting and instruments of affirmation. Today, movements like Black Lives Matter show how historical memory can be transformed into political action. By denouncing racism in America, these movements are not speaking only of the present, but also of centuries of systemic inequality. It is a continuous line that begins in the labor fields of Mesopotamia, passes through the plantations of the American South, and reaches the streets of contemporary cities, where the struggle for equality is still urgent. This heritage also manifests in the economy, in access to education, and in political representation. In Mesopotamia, the descendants of enslaved people rarely managed to rise socially. In the United States, the racial wealth gap shows that even after generations, the inequalities created by slavery and reinforced by discriminatory policies continue to limit opportunities. By understanding the weight of memory, we realize that it is not enough to abolish a system on paper. It is necessary to dismantle the ideas, habits, and narratives that sustain it. The clay and stone of Mesopotamia preserved laws and stories that shaped mentalities for millennia. In the same way, modern culture, media, and education can either perpetuate prejudice or open paths to change. In the next chapter, which will be our conclusion, we will bring together all the threads of this narrative, from the first records of Mesopotamian slavery to the contemporary struggles against racial discrimination, to show that history is not only something that happened, but something that continues to happen. The journey we have traveled from ancient Mesopotamia to modern struggles against racism in America shows that slavery was never just an isolated fact in time. It is a system that crosses centuries, changing form but maintaining the same essence, the dehumanization of some for the benefit of others. When we look at clay tablets with laws and contracts, we do not see only the past. We see the mold of a structure that still influences how our societies function. In Mesopotamia, slavery was formalized by laws like the Code of Hammurabi, meticulously recorded and legitimized by religion. These elements, law, economy, ideology, formed a perfect mechanism for perpetuating oppression. Centuries later, we find the same mechanism operating in slavery in the United States and in systemic racism, only with different parts adapted to the historical and cultural context. By understanding who the enslaved were, their origins, and the brutality of the system that kept them captive, we see that oppression has always been multifaceted: physical, psychological, economic, and cultural. The same pattern repeats in African American history, where exploitation and discrimination renew themselves each generation, even after abolition. The promise of freedom, as we saw in Mesopotamia and in the Emancipation Proclamation, often came with conditions that kept inequality alive. Resistance, whether silent or open, is the thread that links the centuries. Escaping from a Mesopotamian city-state or rebelling on an American plantation required the same courage to challenge a system that seemed unbreakable. And just as in antiquity, modern movements, from the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter, continue to face powerful forces to break from historical structures of domination. The weight of memory is perhaps the deepest aspect of this connection. In Mesopotamia, the official narrative exalted submission as the natural order, while the oppressed preserved their identity and their stories of resistance. Today, the same thing happens. There are those who try to erase or distort the past of slavery and racism, while others fight to keep the truth alive, because they know that memory is a weapon against the repetition of history. This story that began carved in stone is now written in the streets, on social media, in books, and in the conversations we have about justice and equality. Understanding slavery in Mesopotamia is not just an academic exercise. It is a mirror that shows us how the roots of oppression still feed current inequalities. The racial wealth gap, disproportionate police violence, and invisible barriers to education and employment are direct echoes of systems that began millennia ago. The final lesson is clear. Abolishing slavery on paper has never been enough. It is necessary to dismantle the mentalities, systems, and narratives that sustain it. It is necessary to recognize that history is not behind us, but beneath our feet, shaping the ground we walk on. If you have come this far, you already understand that knowing this history is an essential step toward changing it. What was recorded in stone in Mesopotamia reminds us that all oppression is built, and everything that is built can be dismantled. But that requires awareness, action, and courage. And now I ask you, what part of this history will you help rewrite? The fight against racial discrimination and systemic racism does not belong only to the past. It is happening now, and each of us has a role to play.